Thank you all for coming along this evening. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's wonderful to be speaking to a live audience after nearly 2 years of video talks and meetings and all sorts of things like that. So it's good to see some real people. Now, on the drive through town this afternoon to the Eureka Centre, I drove past what was once named Yule's Swamp, which I'm sure you'll otherwise know as Lake Wendouree. Yule's Swamp was of course named after the Scottish pastoralist or pastoralists who set up the station that would become known as Ballarat, a name with strong evidence, of course, of being of Aboriginal origin, but subject to claims for many decades, going back to the earliest 20th century, of Scottish Gaelic origins. Now, I drove past Lake Wendouree, and who do I pass but Robert Burns, Scotland's national poet. Now, what's he doing there? We'll come to that a little bit later, and I'll talk to you about Robert Burns. And I finally arrived here at the Eureka Centre, which is a place that remembers and educates about a political upheaval, a momentous point in Australian history that had as one of its immediate causes the death or the murder of a Scottish miner, James Scobie. Indeed, the subsequent burning of the Eureka Hotel was at very first blamed on unruly Scotsmen. Now, my point really is you don't have to look far to see that the Scots were here in Ballarat. And I went on another drive this afternoon as well. I drove through the Western District, a decent portion of it. And you don't have to look far there either to see that the Scots were around. Just looking at the place names, for example. My book, Garryword, and the Environmental History of the Grampians. The Grampians carries a Scottish name. I've been to the Victorian Grampians and I've been to the Scottish Grampians, and they look nothing alike. But there we are. So this will be my topic today, the Scots in Ballarat and Western Victoria. I'll be broad, my talk will be broad, but hopefully insightful. So let's begin. So from Scotland to Australia, Felix, which is the name, of course, that Mitchell gave Western Victoria, or large parts of it. Now, some people like to say that migration is something Scots did for adventure. And now perhaps for some it was an adventure to travel across the world. Now, I take a rather more pessimistic view, unfortunately. It's a significant choice to leave your home and often your community and your family to get on board a boat and travel across the sea to a place like Australia, which at the time was a strange place for many Scots. It's a difficult choice, but in the 19th century, it was perhaps the justified choice for many Scots. Scotland in the 19th century was a transformed place. It had been transformed by an industrial revolution. Scotland had a once chiefly agricultural economy, and it had become quickly industrialised. Scotland had become the industrial heart of Britain, and its cities were sometimes called the workshops of the empire. So, no longer working the land, people flocked to the cities, places like Glasgow and Edinburgh, which struggled to cope with the influx. Some people were also forcibly removed from the countryside, most famously in the Highlands, to make way for modern, intensive agricultural practices. The situation was only made worse in the cities by population increases. Cities were crowded, polluted places. Housing in Scottish cities was a particular problem and would remain so until well into the 20th century, after the Second World War at the very least. Violent crime in Scottish cities skyrocketed, although it's a bit of a paradox because Scotland never sent as many convicts to Australia as England and Ireland did. In many European countries and in many of the British nations, industrialisation usually stemmed the outflow of people to the colonies, stemming the outflow of people looking for opportunities abroad. But this wasn't the case for Scotland. In Scotland in the 19th century, more than half of its natural population increase left Scotland, for greener pastures, so to speak. Now, many Scots went to England. Many took a further step to Canada, the United States and New Zealand, and of course, Australia. Britain's colonies dominated destinations and included India and South Africa, which also had sizable Scottish populations. Now, as I already said, Scotland never sent as many convicts to Australia as England did, and there's all sorts of various reasons for that, chiefly because of Scotland's legal system, which was a little bit different. The figure in terms of convicts was about 8,000 out of 160,000 or so convicts sent to Australia up until the middle of the 19th century. So there were very few convicts from Scotland. There were also very few free migrants from Scotland at the very beginning. The first application for from a Scottish free migrant was not made until 1814. So most Scots in Australia, mostly in eastern Australia, were either convicts, colonial administrators, they belonged to the military, or they were sailors and merchants. Scots were overrepresented among the colonial authorities. Now, despite these initial small numbers, by the end of the 1820s, in some years, up to half of the applications to migrate and to take up land were made by Scots. So there was a sudden enthusiasm for Scotland, and it had much to do with conditions at home. There was a scarcity of rentable farms for people to work on, and there was an impetus to find positions for younger sons. So wealthy agriculturalists sought investment opportunities and work abroad, and Australia represented significant opportunities. So the availability of those substantial land grants and the government's provision of cheap labour as well were attractive to those opportunistic lowland Scots. At first, these free migrants were a mix of farmers and merchants and those military officers as well. There were artisans and labourers as well, and landowners, of course. Mostly they were people of their own means. They were able to come out here by themselves. Later on, as migration started to really respond to the labour market needs in Australia, migrants came to represent more of a cross-section of Scottish society, and there were many more people coming from Scotland from more humble backgrounds, maidservants, urban and rural labourers and shepherds, particularly Highland shepherds. Now, in Australia, where Scots already accounted for a large proportion of the squatters, the number of labourers and shepherds who followed was also high. And this had to do with the way Scots like to do business. They like to hire family members. They like to hire other people from Scotland. There were some particularly Scottish parts of Australia by the middle of the 19th century. Moreton Bay, where over half were Scots, and that was also the case in Western Victoria. For the Port Phillip district in general, over 40% of those people who held land were from Scotland. Places like New England and Darling Downs as well were particularly Scottish, where around a third of pastoralists were Scots. Now, all this activity around land and pastoralism brings me to Ballarat and Western Victoria. From the 1830s, particularly after Thomas Mitchell's 1836 expedition, Western Victoria was opened up to agriculturalists and pastoralists looking for opportunities abroad. Scots were enthusiastic imperialists. They contributed greatly to the British Empire in terms of commerce and trade and colonisation. From the middle of the 19th century onwards, it was not only Scotland's emigrating population that contributed to the settlement of places like Western Victoria, but also Scottish money and investment. So it wasn't just the migrants, it was also Scottish money. Scottish investment in the Australian pastoral industry was significant. One of the first major companies, overseas companies, operating in Australia was a Scottish-Australian investment company of Aberdeen. There was also the Australian Investment Company of Edinburgh and Leith, George Russell's Clyde Company, and Neil Black and his company. Neil Black is pictured here. So Scottish investment in the Australian pastoral industry was significant, but so was on-the-ground involvement. There were hundreds of smaller-scale landholders and pastoralists. In some cases, Scottish families held enormous pastoral dynasties across numerous brothers, fathers, uncles and sons at first, and eventually sisters and mothers as well. Scots drew a reputation for their clannishness because of the nature of their business operations in the colony. Now, early on, I've already mentioned, around Ballarat were the cousins Archibald and William Yule, who took up country along the Yarrawee River, and around Black Hill and present-day Wendouree. The Learmonth brothers, of course, were at Buninyong early on. Scots like these were prominent among the pastoralists and among the pastoral labourers as well. They were, of course, also involved in the gold rushes at all levels. The Scots who came as squatters would sometimes become proprietors of gold mines, the Learmonths, for example. But Scots were also involved in the commercial and professional industries that grew up around the mining industry in Ballarat. They were bankers and merchants, they were mine managers and business owners, but they were also miners themselves and foundry workers, for example. Gold mining in Ballarat, in and around Ballarat, supported the kind of community growth in which Scots were well placed to become civic leaders. And they did become overrepresented in those civic leadership roles. They had a prominence among the well-to-do middle classes and also among the wealthy landowners. And this is kind of reflected in their settlement patterns across Ballarat. If you look at the census data in Ballarat, Scots tended to be found in the west in the 19th century. This was the growing, prosperous part of town, developing along Sturt Street. They were less likely to be found in the east, which was prone, for example, to floods and fires. So being Scottish was more than just their birthplace. In Ballarat and Western Victoria, Scottish migrants represented a kind of dependent and hard-working migrant, which was reflected in the disproportionate recruitment of Scots into the town's elite. So being Scottish was an opportunity because of the reputation, but it was also an identity for many. So for all migrants in 19th century Australia, the process of colonisation gave opportunities to give the country and the landscape with new meanings and associations. Scots could inscribe, if you want to put it this way, on the Western District landscape their own Scottish culture and identity. We've already seen this with the renaming of Garryword to the Grampians. The naming of places gave the landscape social and cultural significance for Scots and made reference points for their identity and for their community. In Australia, across Australia, place names of Scottish origins constitute around 17% of non-Indigenous place names. Lowland place names dominate, reflecting the dominance of lowlanders in migrant flows. But places with Highland and Gaelic-speaking populations took on names from the Highlands as well. Around here, we can look to Scotsburn, Scotchman's Lead, Invermay, Learmonth, Ercildoune. Further out into the Western District, places like Glen Thompson, Dunkeld, the Grange Burn, which travels through Hamilton, and the list goes on. You'll no doubt be able to point to many Scottish place names in Western Victoria and around Ballarat. There are also street names in towns like Ballarat and cities like Ballarat, I should say. that were given Scottish names, which often reflected that prominence of Scots and Scottish Australians in civic and commercial life. So if you go out and look around town, you'll see plenty of Scottish names. You might be familiar also with some of the Western Victorian homesteads. These homesteads often took on names that either were borrowed from Scotland or simply recalled Scottish names, as did large pastoral properties around the district. You might be familiar with the Ercildoune homestead, which was built by the Limont brothers. Now, these newly crowned lords, and you have to remember these Scots were taking on land that was sometimes a decent percentage of their home country in terms of their size, so they certainly felt like they were lords. They built these grand homesteads, often in a Scottish style, and in doing so they left an important architectural legacy across the region, both as architects and their clients. Now, a couple of years ago, the art gallery here in Ballarat held an exhibition for Auld Lang Syne, which was all about Scottish images from Australia. Wealthy colonial Scots purchased artworks by Scottish painters for their homes in Australia, and many Australian public institutions, including our art gallery here, also purchased Scottish art for their own collections. Highland landscape scenes were quite popular. Now, painting and art provided chances for the reimagination of Australia along European lines. For example, many of Eugene von Gerard's landscape paintings from the 1850s and 1860s were commissioned by Scottish pastoralists. There are also Scottish painters working in Australia. Someone like Joseph Panton, who painted the Western District and Western Victoria. Another Scottish artist, James Cass, who worked in Australia, was said to be greatly influenced by, and I quote, the sombre bracken browns of 19th century Scottish landscape artists. And he brought that vision to his paintings of Australia. Now, apart from imagining and painting the Australian landscape, migration and particularly pastoralism involved the introduction of new land management systems and, of course, animals to Western Victoria, which, of course, physically altered the environment. Now, Indigenous Australians had themselves been transforming their environments for millennia, but the intensified cultivation and resource use which formed the basis of many colonial industries, brought their own environmental impacts. Interestingly, in a letter to Charles La Trobe in the 1850s, it was a Scottish pastoralist, John G. Robinson, from Wando Vale, who was one of the first to notice the process of land degradation and soil erosion. And as Mitchell had said earlier in 1835, he felt conscious of being the bringer of mighty changes, and that was very true. If the land experienced mighty changes, so did its people. So the question of Scottish Indigenous relations is a relatively new one for historians, for academic historians at least. It can bring some surprising answers and some anecdotes even, but it can also be a difficult subject, especially in the context of increased interest in our Scottish ancestry. In North America, historians with Scottish sympathies have tried to argue that Scots got along better with Indigenous peoples because of Scotland's clan structures and because of the experience of the Highland clearances. Now, unfortunately, despite some anecdotes, this is mostly not borne out on the evidence. Scots were enthusiastic imperialists and all that entailed, but this is not to say that Scots and Indigenous Australians failed to get along at all. And indeed, there are a number of fascinating cross-cultural communications and interactions in the written record. For example, the Glasgow-born Kathleen Kirkland wrote in 1845 of one such instance, which I've placed on the board. And she wrote that while the Wallarong people were going through their strange antics, a tall, handsome man jumped into their midst. He let out a wild shriek and then began to dance a fierce Highland fling. The blacks stopped and looked on, half frightened and half amused. When he had finished, he let out a tremendous Highland war cry. The image here is of a Highlander entering into a corroboree and dancing a Highland fling. There are a number of recorded instances of Scots and Aboriginal Australians joining in corroborees. But it's, of course, an inescapable fact that the Scots were involved in frontier violence as well. Neil Black, who I mentioned earlier, the Scottish pastoralist, was acutely aware of this. He famously wrote in 1839 that the best way to acquire land is to go outside and take up a new run, provided the conscience of the party is sufficiently seared to enable him without remorse to slaughter natives right and left. It is universally and distinctly understood that the chances are very small indeed of a person taking up a new run being able to maintain possession of his place and property without having recourse to such means. Now, as Scots in Scotland look towards independence as a nation, they are increasingly, over recent years, looking back at elements of their past that have sometimes been obscured, often by a sense of national triumphalism, and Australia is part of that conversation. So I'm going to turn now to the question of how did Scots support each other in their adopted countries? And in this case, how did they do so in Australia, Western Victoria and Ballarat? From the very first days of Scottish settlement, there'd been some informal and formal Scottish organisations. Most of these were St Andrews clubs and societies, and their main activities were to organise music and dancing, and many of them were charitable organisations which were aimed at supporting the new arrivals. Longer-lasting organisations didn't really emerge in Victoria until the gold rushes. The Caledonian Society of Victoria was very successful between 1859 and 1862. The 1850s also saw the emergence of societies in Geelong, as well as the long-lasting Maryborough Highland Society. The Scots in Ballarat formed their Caledonian Society relatively early in 1858. For many years, it would hold Highland Games on New Year's Day, starting in 1859 at the Eastern Oval. Burns Night on January 25 was also very popular in Ballarat. Celebrations were held at the Edinburgh Castle Hotel, which became the headquarters of the Caledonian Society. In fact, in the new century, between 1902 and 1910, 31 new Scottish organisations were formed in Victoria alone. Many of them were in Western Victoria, where new waves of Scots were arriving, or where older Scots were passing on, and the new generation sought to preserve their cultural identities. There was a popular ideal of Scots and Scottishness promoted by these early associations, and the view was that Scots were staunch supporters and contributors to the British Empire. It was a kind of imperial sentiment which was widespread, and it was reflected well beyond the clubs and associations. At home in Scotland in the 19th century, many thought of themselves as equal partners, if not superior, in the British Empire. And it makes sense that that idea travelled in the baggage of Scottish migrants to their new homes. Scottishness even began to incorporate some Antipodean symbols and themes, For example, there was a Highland Games in Geelong would award contestants with a medal, and on that medal was a Highlander and an Aboriginal Australian. Now, in Australia, there was perhaps more tartan than in Scotland, and there's a joke that the further away a Scot gets from home, the more Scottish he becomes or she becomes. Now, the difference here is that many of these clubs were male entry only, so there were Scottish women's associations as well, which were highly popular. These associations, I guess, contributed to a sense of community and identity for Scottish migrants and their descendants. Now, if they were perhaps closed off to non-Scots, there were also considerably more public recognitions of Scottish culture and identity. This is a sort of a favourite topic of mine. The place or the prominence of Scottish migrants in Australian communities, especially in the 19th century, is attested to in monuments and memorials all around Australia. I've counted them up, or I've had a go at counting them up, and there are close to 100 identifiably Scottish sites which remember various prominent Scots or Scottish Australians. We've got monuments dedicated to Scottish colonial pioneers, statues of Scottish politicians in Australia, depictions of Scottish national heroes, memorials to Scottish military units that were established in Australia, and plenty of other memorials commemorating the Australia-Scotland connection. There are over 60 public monuments to famous, prominent or influential Scots in Australia. There are 8 burned statues across the country. For Victoria, beyond Melbourne, there's of course one here in Ballarat, unveiled in 1887, and a bust in Bendigo, apparently. I haven't seen it. Camperdown's burned statue was the first in Australia, or I should say it's the oldest in the world, is the claim. Ballarat's Botanic Gardens is also home to a unique statue of William Wallace. It's one of maybe 2 or 3 Wallace statues outside of Scotland in the entire world. Perhaps less known is the bronze statue of Sir Walter Scott, which stands outside the Civic Hall. It was unveiled in 1962 after much deliberation over who should get the honour of being represented. We also, of course, have cemeteries and churches and all those place names I mentioned. It's a remarkable and persistent record of the Scots in Australia, and in Ballarat it's particularly prominent, especially with these 3 statues. It wasn't all Caledonian societies burned statues and tartan, though. There was also church and schools, which were incredibly important to the Scottish migrants who came here. With the establishment and growth of the Presbyterian churches in Victoria, also came schools and colleges attached to them. Think, for example, of some prominent examples such as Geelong College, or out further west, the old Hamilton and Western District College, which began in the 1870s and was eventually attached to the Presbyterian Secondary School for Girls, the Alexandra College. Likewise, here in Ballarat, the Reverend William Henderson established Ballarat College in 1864, which was attached to his church in Sturt Street. The Clarendon Presbyterian Ladies' College was established in 1876, and the two would eventually merge, of course. Henderson, the Reverend William Henderson, was an early Presbyterian minister in Ballarat, and he was associated with the building of St Andrew's Kirk on Sturt Street. Presbyterianism was perhaps the most important institutional manifestation of Scottish nationhood. Scots are often equated with Presbyterianism, and it's true to say that the Scottish migrants tended to be far more denominationally monolithic than any of the other British national groups. High percentages of Scottish migrants were Presbyterian. Initially, in the Ballarat area, Presbyterian worship was in the hands of the Free Church, which had broken away from the established Church of Scotland. Early on, the Reverend Thomas Hastie preached to Free Church congregations in and around Buninyong. He had arrived in 1842 and was encouraged and supported by the Scottish pastoralists of the region to come to the area around Ballarat and Buninyong and preach to the region's Presbyterians. So national and religious identities had long been integrated in Scotland when immigration to Australia began. So being a Presbyterian was important to Scottish migrants. In the more remote regions of Western Victoria, Presbyterian worship tended to take place in the homes of squatters or townspeople. Especially for the Free Church, the services were given in Gaelic. Many of the Presbyterians in Western Victoria only spoke and understood Gaelic, especially those Highland labourers and Highland shepherds who had been brought out to work on properties. And eventually, Gaelic simply became the preferred language of worship. As I said, that was especially the case for the Free Church Presbyterians. And so the ability to come together and worship and converse together in Gaelic would have contributed to a shared sense of Scottish identity and community to help sustain that community, especially for the new migrants. And it was no different in Ballarat. So the question is, I guess, what is the Scots' influence in Western Victoria and Ballarat? I think we know that Scots were pastoralists. They were involved in the colonisation of Australia and all that entailed, for better or worse. Wherever they settled, they brought with them a piece of home. In many cases, they named their properties and their places after Scotland. They came together to celebrate their Scottish identity and their culture and their traditions, and sometimes they invented new traditions. In celebrating their identities, they left permanent marks on the landscape, from place names to monuments and memorials. I'm going to end here with some words from the poet Henry Lawson, who came to Ballarat and he saw the statue of Robert Burns, and he touched on some themes that I've spoken about today in terms of communities of support for new migrants. And the poem goes like this: "To a town in southern land, light of purse, I come and lone, and I pause a while and stand by pedestal of stone, and I bend my head and bow, while my heart to Scotland turns, for I know I'm standing now 'neath the form of Robbie Burns. Round the corners of the lips, lines of laughter seem to run. From the merry eye there slips just a twinkle as of fun. Living in the sculptor's art, set in stone, mine eye discerns all the beauty and a part of the soul of Robert Burns. One of Caledonia's sons coming lonely to the land, well might think he'd met a friend who would take him by the hand, and the tears spring to his eyes while his heart for friendship yearns, and from out that heart he cries, heaven bless thee, Bobby Burns." So certainly the Burns statue in Ballarat represents the power of those national heroes and national symbols as key reference points for a sense of belonging and identity within migrant communities. So Scots came together to support each other, not only in clubs and societies, but in churches and schools too, because, as I said, the decision to leave home is not one that was taken lightly. Perhaps for many of these Scots, it was the right decision in the end. To conclude then, Scottish migrants in the 19th century in Western Victoria and Ballarat left a long-lasting and very visible legacy. I hope that my talk this afternoon has illuminated some of that history. Thank you.